Hello again. Welcome to part 2 of the Climate Change Emergency Masterclass. And what we're going to talk about to begin with is the question, is man-made climate change real or fake? Now, you've been told that 97% of climate scientists believe in man-made global warming. Well, first thing I'll tell you is this is actually false, factually false. And secondly, it's irrelevant. See, it doesn't matter how many people believe anything. Science is not about belief, it's about evidence and fact. And it doesn't matter how many important people or would be pop stars or whatever tell you something. In science, it has to come down to facts, not opinions. And in fact, consensus has never advanced science. It's held science back. The actual facts on this matter, though, are there was a scientific paper produced by somebody which gave these percentages, but another scientific paper by David Leggett, and it's mentioned in this presentation PowerPoint, he examined this and found that actually only 0.3% of those scientific papers actually said that they understood from their researches that man had contributed to more than half of the warming since 1950. The other people said nothing or very little. They merely put climate change, words to that effect, in the headlines because that's the way they were going to collect funding. Funding is driving what these people say. And you have to decide for yourself, not this sort of distorted information. Now, what is the crucial question before us? Right, if you think of the atmosphere as something the height of Big Ben, or a pole the height of Big Ben of 316 feet, the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere would be just 1.5 inches on the top of it. And man's contribution to the flux of CO2 in and out of the atmosphere on a weekly, monthly, annual, decadal average is only 0.04% of the atmosphere, which is like a piece of bird dropping on the top of Big Ben Tower. So we've been asked to believe that something the size of a bird dropping on the top of Big Ben Tower is the main controller of what happens in that tower. Now, it's a bit of a stretch, isn't it? But okay, let's just see what they're looking for in detail. For this CO2 narrative to be true, that mankind is running the show or significantly affecting the show, first of all, is that man's 4% of the CO2 flux has to control the rest of nature's CO2 flux, which is 96%. Well, that's a bit of a stretch, isn't it? And the second thing, of course, is that CO2 itself has to be the main controller of temperature and climate, which again is a stretch from what we've looked at. So let's look at the first one. If man is controlling the rest of nature, then nature has to follow man. Okay. Now, termites produce a lot more CO2 and CO2 equivalent in methane or whatever than man. So, I ask you, when you drive a car around your block of flats, do termites in Africa suddenly start farting? Because they have to follow man if man is dominating the world's natural CO2. And if they don't, then we're wasting our time. We should be having a war on termites. A war on termites would be more effective than stopping people flying, because termites produce a lot more CO2 equivalent. Okay, well, are you convinced or are you not? Just think about it. You raise that with anyone who believes in man-made climate change. Why don't you have a war on termites instead of a war on travel or eating meat or driving a car, taking your family to the seaside, whatever? Their policies are anti-family. Think about that. Okay, now to talk about, you know, the CO2 driver or not, I'm just going to show you a little picture. This is an Escher print. And it's there because, well, it shows you water flowing uphill. I mean, you agree, look at it, it flows uphill. Goes along that channel, up, 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 and then it comes down in the waterfall. Right. Well, you know that if you tried to make that out of some bits of wood, you wouldn't be able to make it. And, you know, and it fits well in with the background as well, doesn't it? Which is, must be something clever about that too, to make it look, you know, it sort of supports the main thing. So it's a false narrative, isn't it? You see, what we have there is a three-dimensional reality represented in 2 dimensions. Okay. Now, you see, physics, of course, is also some representation of reality, but you might not be told the whole picture. And indeed, physics itself doesn't understand all of reality anyway. You see, physics develops concepts, which we hope describes nature, and the relationships between these physics concepts we hope will describe how nature will develop. But it can enable you to explain, describe, and even predict things. But the physics itself is not nature. It's a simplification. And people who are telling you they're talking physics, they might be talking a simplification of physics or a misunderstanding of physics, if physics is accurate anyway. And that is what we have here. We have a total misrepresentation of the physics which is used to justify ideologically something which is not happening anyway. But these days, people believe more in theory than they do in evidence, which is insane. It's an anti-scientific era we live in. Now, let's look at the facts then. This is a graph, and this here time goes from right to left because that's the way ice cores are drilled. And here you can see that the Antarctic temperatures at the end of the last ice age went up before CO2 levels went up, and that was a consistent pattern. So you can see from that temperatures drive CO2, not the other way round. Now, I raised this at a meeting in Imperial College, for example, and the then head of physics, Joanna Haigh, said, well, yes, Piers, yes, we know that's true. So they admit it. Look, experts admit this is true because they did the measurements. This was, you know, a UN-sponsored measurement. And she said, oh, yes, Piers, we know it's true, but that extra CO2 that's driven off by the rising temperatures will then cause an extra rise of temperatures after it. Okay? Well, look at the graph. Is that there or not? The answer is no, it is not. There is not an extra rise of temperatures after that peak of CO2. So the claims are false, false, and false. Okay? Now, question, but how the hell does this 800-year or whatever lag happen? Because, well, it's a long time, isn't it? Well, what we do know about the sea is simplified. You can say it's in 2 levels, an upper level and a lower level. The lower level is cold and the upper level is relatively warmer. And the sea holds 50 times more CO2 than the air. Okay. And when you warm up the sea, CO2 will come off, and if you cool it down, it'll come in. So there's a dynamic interplay between CO2 in the sea and out of the sea. And basically, if you put some CO2 in the air, it'll disappear into the sea and be replaced by other CO2 from the sea in about 3 years, right? Not long, or maybe 5 years, but that sort of thing. So what happened, we think, in the medieval warm period, for example, was the sea was warming up, lots of extra CO2 came off, but then, of course, that causes melting of Greenland, and then that very cold water from Greenland goes into the sea and gets subducted underneath the warmer layer. And that very cold CO2 will absorb, that very cold water will absorb, gobble up that extra CO2. So this extra CO2 will get subducted under the ocean, as you can see in this picture. So we've got the extra CO2 there being subducted under the ocean. And where does it go next? Now, these are relatively modern understandings, in the last 20 years. These things have only been understood. Here we have a simplified picture of what is believed to have happened and has been measured to happen in terms of measuring ocean currents deep down. The cold Atlantic CO2 rich water has been had a long holiday and gone under the sea and turned up again in the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean, typically 800 years later. The medieval warm period went on for some time, which is why this increase of CO2 has been going on for some time. And it's nothing to do with man. In fact, you can put whatever CO2 you like in the atmosphere. If you put in too much, if you like, above the natural level, it'll go into the sea. If you try and take it out by expensive processes which you would be taxed for to save the planet, it will just come out of the sea. Nature runs itself. So, let's have a little summary of where we are now at this point. CO2 levels are an effect, not a cause of changes in climate. That's observed fact. Secondly, man's carbon dioxide is only 4% of man's carbon dioxide is only 4% of the total carbon dioxide flux in and out of the biosphere and the water sphere and the land sphere. The idea that man controls nature's CO2 is a mad conspiracy theory of nature. Okay? Now, it's obvious, therefore, anyway, that the sea rules, not man, and actually we'll show later that the sun rules the sea. But when we have these extremes, the wild jet stream analysis shows that all these extremes of weather we're having now are the wrong type of extremes for the CO2 story, because the wild jet stream requires a flatter, further north shifted jet stream in the northern hemisphere, that is. So let's have a quick look at the bad science that we're talking about. Where is the CO2? Most of the CO2 that's going around is in the sea. There's a little picture just to get that clear in your minds. Now, what we're told by this current theory is that somehow the extra CO2 acts as or CO2 acts as a blanket around the Earth, and infrared radiation from the surface of the Earth goes into it and warms it up, and then that warming radiation comes back and warms the surface from whence it came. Now, it's a bit strange, isn't it, you think? But anyway, that's what they say. So there's a diagram of it. Now, you see, actually, these arrows on that diagram aren't reality at all. That doesn't happen like that. The radiation does go in, but it only goes up 25, 30 metres or so, and then it disappears, and it doesn't. When a CO2 molecule has been hit by, or water vapour molecule, or any molecule hit by some infrared, it doesn't think, oh my God, I'm going to now release another infrared. It might cause a vaporisation of a water blob or something. You see what I mean? There's not conservation of photons of infrared, for example. Anyway, let's have a look at the general idea. So, it is an observed fact, yes, that if you shine an infrared beam into a bottle of CO2 and a bottle of air with less CO2, then the temperature rises quicker where there's the CO2 and less where there's less CO2. Okay, so they say, well, they are proven, end of story. However, let's wait, because what this idea shows is that the rate of absorption of infrared is bigger for a so-called greenhouse gas. But it's also the case that the rate of emission is bigger. So all these infrared absorbers are also infrared emitters. And everything in the atmosphere absorbs infrared to an extent. Some very, inefficient and some highly efficient. Water itself water vapour is an efficient one too. Now, what will happen after a while? Well, this is what will happen after a while. The extra CO2 warms up quicker and the other one warms up and they reach the same temperature. And then if the source, if you like, goes off, then the extra CO2 cools down. So there's not going to be an extra warming of the CO2. Or is there? Just suppose there is, then what we're going to have is this graph. We'd have the red one there, reaches a higher temperature than the other one. But wait a minute, let's think about this. We've got some air above the ground, and for the sake of argument, because you know it gets cooler higher, we could think of air, if it's going right to left, on the same level. So where the CO2 is, it stays warmer than where there's less CO2. So you could have a bag of CO2 and a bag of less CO2, and you would have a permanent temperature difference between them. So you could run a heat engine between them. And of course, the CO2 one has reached a higher temperature than the source, because we're saying, well, okay, the air has reached the same temperature as the thing. So this violates, first of all, the basic principle in physics that all objects, whatever colour, in a radiating chamber reach the same temperature. It violates that. But it also means that we could run a little heat engine between the two, which gets something for nothing. So we could have an infinite source of energy just by playing around with CO2 like this. That would be against the first law of thermodynamics. And the other one is, of course, it's against the second law of thermodynamics, because the temperature, if something's in equilibrium with the ground, you can't have two things not in separate equilibriums, so-called, or non-equilibriums. So all the laws of thermodynamics are broken by this theory, and they don't work in practice, as you know. But let's have a look at another little practical application of the CO2 theory. Suppose the bottle with extra CO2 actually does get warmer than the one with less CO2. Is this possible? Well, suppose the one with less CO2 gets to equilibrium with the ground, then it means the other one has got warmer, and therefore heat is flowing from a cooler object to a warmer object. Well, that is against the second law of thermodynamics. It's got heat flowing uphill, so to speak. That is not allowed, and it also violates the related principle that objects in a radiating environment, if they were just there in a vacuum, for example, reach the same temperature irrespective of their colour. Now let's have a look at radiation physics. We're going to look at these objects and imagine them communicating their heat only by radiation. They're in a vacuum. So we're ignoring conduction and convection. And the important thing to understand is that the red one, the yellow one, the green one, the white one, the black one, whatever, they are all going to reach the same temperature in equilibrium in a radiation environment. They reach the same temperature independent of their colour. Because if that wasn't true, and suppose the black gets warmer than the white, say, or the yellow, then, and stayed warmer, then you could run a heat engine between the two of them, which would get something for nothing and violate the first law of thermodynamics. So that is a basic rule of radiation physics. In a radiating environment, all objects will reach the same temperature independent of their colour. Now, the darker one, the black one, say, will get warmer quicker, but it will also cool down quicker than a white one or a lighter one. That is about rate of change. We're talking about what happens after a period of time, a longer period of time, in equilibrium. Objects reach the same temperature independent of their colour. And there's a second problem with this theory, namely that if the CO2 bottle and the other bottle reach different temperatures and stay like that, then you could run a heat engine between the two of them and get energy out for nothing, which is against the first law of thermodynamics, which is about conservation of energy. Now, interestingly, an American double glazing company applied the CO2 theory to double glazing. And they said, oh yeah, great idea. We're going to make double glazing with a CO2 sandwich. So that means we're going to warm the inside of the house. All right. Well, they tried this out and it didn't work. It had no effect whatsoever. Nothing happened at all. And well, you think about that and you can see why this business went bust. It's because the physical theory is incorrect. So now we're going to have a look at a demonstration which shows you why. Let's look at this idea that you could put carbon dioxide as the filler in the space in a double glazing window, and it should make rooms warmer than if you just had air, rather like the CO2 blanket, as they call it, above the earth is meant to make it warmer. So here we have a model of a room and a window. So the idea is that this CO2 will somehow make the room warmer. Now, in fact, it doesn't work. It's been tested. And it's not difficult really to understand, because we know that the CO2 in there is going to reach the same equilibrium temperature as the room, or tend to that, irrespective of its colour, whether it's a dark absorber or a lesser absorber. And if you imagine actually the idea that this room is going to get warmer, you ask, well, how does the CO2 know which side is inside and which side is out? So why shouldn't it get warmer outside? Or put another way, suppose we had the wall or the window in the middle of a room of same temperature each side. According to the CO2 argument, that side will get warmer, and this side will get warmer. Well, why not? So both sides will get warmer. Well, if both sides are getting warmer, where does the energy come from? You've got something for nothing, which of course violates the conservation of energy, otherwise known as the first law of thermodynamics. So that is why the CO2 double glazing idea doesn't work, and it also shows why the CO2 blanket and back radiation theory is incorrect. So where are we now? This CO2 blanket theory or back radiation theory is bad physics. It violates basic thermodynamics. And there's also some interesting killer facts which go with its failure. You see, carbon dioxide in equilibrium, or anything in equilibrium, cannot radiate more than it receives. So you can't have a blanket. It doesn't work like that. Also notably, the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is higher up than the ground, so it's actually colder. So if you're just going to talk about radiation, the radiation coming off that backwards is going to be less than coming forwards from the ground. So, you know, it's just not simple. And the CO2 molecules themselves can't retain heat. They don't retain heat. In fact, they can only take heat and keep it for a tenth of a millisecond tops, and this is in a number of scientific papers. So the whole idea doesn't work. Now, the theoreticians themselves know that this theory doesn't work, but they still teach it. And I'll give you a little story on that. I was at a meeting in the Russian Academy of Sciences in 2004, and we'd been invited there, me and Richard Lindzen from America, a very well-known professor there, and a number of other people from around the world. And we'd been invited to Moscow by Andrei Ilyanov, Putin's chief scientific advisor. And we were going to be there to argue with the Met Office, who were going to come to tell the Russians what to do and sign the Kyoto Protocol. So Andrei Ilyanov, he told us this story while they were on the way. He said, "Oh, I just phoned the Met Office when they're at Heathrow Airport and told them that you guys are here. And they said, oh, well, you're not coming then." But Andrei Ilyanov said to us, "I knew they would," and sure enough, they did come. And they were fuming. Now, at that meeting, I showed a number of graphs, and as did Richard Lindzen and many people. And I showed a graph of temperatures and smoothed out solar activity moving together in front of Sir John Houghton. And I said, wouldn't it be nice if one of these was temperatures and the other CO2? Well, he didn't say anything, and he's normally not lost for words. And in the break, interestingly, some of us said to the guys from the Met Office, because we broke up into little just chatting, you know. He said, look, this idea of back radiation and equilibrium at different levels of the atmosphere or full radiation is nonsense. It doesn't work like that. And these guys said, yeah, we know it doesn't work like that. We know this is a simplification, but this is what we teach in schools. In schools, that's what he said. And it is taught in schools, as you well know, and the BBC teaches it. And the Royal Society, even now, teach it when they know it is false. I said to the guy who told us this, yes, but look here, this isn't a school. This is the Russian Academy of Sciences. Then he went off. He stopped talking to us, which is, an abomination. Now, of course, there can be all sorts of little extra arguments and so on, but in the bottom line is their theory doesn't work. Well, now we're going to look at a CO2 theory which should work. It doesn't actually work, but, the basis of it is sound physics to an extent. Right. This is the lapse rate theory. If you go up in the atmosphere, or you go up in a mountain, as you know, it gets cooler. And it gets cooler because air, when it goes upwards in a bag, has to do work against the air above to expand, and that causes cooling. Or if you like, if you throw up something in the air, like a ball, then, or that could be a molecule moving under gravity, its speed is lower, higher up, which means the temperature is going to be lower, higher up. Okay, so you go up in the atmosphere, it gets cooler and cooler. Now, you're going to get to a place eventually where infrared radiation will actually escape into space. As it is, infrared radiation just goes, 20 yards or so, and then is absorbed. And then whatever happens there may or may not produce something, but, the average temperature of that will allow infrared to go from that level further up. But at a certain level, infrared can escape into space, and that will enable the Earth to cool. Okay? If you've got more CO2 or water vapour or bits of cardboard or soot or anything floating around, then where there's less of that, the infrared can escape into space. So that level where that infrared can escape is important. And if there's more CO2, it will move that level upwards, physically upwards, because there's going to be less CO2 in front of it, between it and space, to hold it to cause absorption. The level of the top of the atmosphere for these thermodynamic purposes goes up. So the distance down to the surface then is bigger. The temperature at the surface will therefore be bigger. That is their argument. Now, it might be small, but that's their argument. It doesn't happen though, but let's have a look why. First of all, there is a problem with actually at the surface where if there's more CO2, it will make plants grow more, and then they transpire more, and therefore they cool more, which is why forests are cooler than open fields, cool more and cause cooling at the surface. So, the effect might get negated anyway by the CO2 growth effect. But let's leave that apart and look at the actual fluctuations themselves. Now, if there's more CO2 around, of course, another thing that will happen at the upper level is that the temperatures day and night will change more. And you see this picture they're giving you is a kind of static picture. Well, it's not. The atmosphere is not static. There's day-night big variations of temperature everywhere. Now, what happens there? So we have a temperature diagram. Range of temperatures 2R goes up with extra CO2. So you can have the average radiation out is that formula you see, and that goes as the fourth power of the radiation, of the temperature, right? And then you can work out an average, you see, as on that formula. Now, if you think about it, obviously, if you've got fourth powers involved, then you're going to have interesting things happening, because the average of the fourth powers is bigger than the fourth power of the average, right? Just as an example, take 1, 2 and 3. 1 to the fourth plus 3 to the fourth is 1 plus 81, which is 82, and you halve that, you get 41. 2 to the fourth is 16. So the bigger the range, the more radiation which will go into space, which would be a cooling. Now, the CO2 theory said there was going to be a hot spot above the equator after 10 years due to the extra CO2, etc. And that comes from their circulation models and, the thing about the CO2 itself absorbing more energy, you see. Well, what happened? The graph on the left is their theory. The graph on the right is what happened. What was observed was a cold spot, and that has not been explained in terms of their theory. It means their theory is completely bankrupt in theory as well as in practice. But you see, they're still adhering to a very scientific sounding representation of some aspects of physics. You see, this is what they show you in these documents. It looks really, really clever, doesn't it? You see, they've got all these graphs and they show, well, the right-hand bit is radiation, extra radiation coming in, back radiation they call it, due to more CO2 or more whatever. They put various things on there, you see, nitrous oxide and so forth. Okay. But that's delusional nonsense. The top two sections of that graph are completely delusional. There's no evidence for this back radiation, and there's no evidence for man-made climate change. Okay, so we're going to end part 2 there, and I hope you're going to come back to hear part 3, which is more about what really makes weather and climate change.